His name was Rin. He was 16 years old, and he had been walking for 6 straight days. Slung over his shoulder was a leather bag filled with pale purple seashells, the kind found only along a coastline far away, so far away that Rin himself had never even seen the ocean. He hadn't gathered those shells himself. His father had received them from a stranger 2 seasons earlier, a man he had never met before, at an open clearing where dozens of different groups gathered every time the full moon followed the harvest. Now it was Rin's turn to carry them farther, toward the mountains, where there was a glossy black stone, sharp as a razor, that his tribe desperately needed for spear points. If you asked Rin whether he was going to the market, he wouldn't understand what you meant. To him, this was simply something that had to be done, a part of life, just like hunting or starting a fire. But if you step back and look at the bigger picture, what Rin was doing was actually one link in what you would now call a supply chain. The only difference was that there were no trucks, no warehouses, and every link in the chain was a real person, walking hundreds of miles barefoot. You might picture ancient humans living in complete isolation, each family hunting, gathering, and making everything they needed on their own, depending on no one else, as if they were each living on their own private island, just like in a survival movie. That's the image most people have when they think of prehistoric humans. But archaeologists have uncovered evidence showing the exact opposite. Rin was not an isolated case. He was one of countless other Rins, all across the world, carrying objects over hundreds, even thousands of miles, together forming a vast exchange network that none of them could see in its entirety. The glossy black stone Rin was searching for was called obsidian volcanic glass, formed only at a small number of volcanoes around the world. Yet archaeologists have found obsidian tools at sites more than 300 miles from their source. More than 300 miles, with no roads, no vehicles, no compass, only feet like Rin's, generation after generation. The stone he was about to bring home had not been born where he would eventually find it. It had already lived a life of its own, passing through the hands of many people long before Rin was even born. That night, Rin stopped at the very clearing his father had told him about, the place where tribes gathered during the full moon. He hadn't expected it to be so large. There were hundreds of people, with temporary shelters set up everywhere, speaking languages he had never heard before, carrying furs, salt, gemstones, and stories from distant lands. This was not a roofed marketplace like the one you might imagine. It was more like a great festival, something like an ancient version of Black Friday combined with a family wedding and a hometown reunion, all happening at the same time, only once a year, and everyone had to walk for days to get there. Rin sat down beside an old man who was bargaining with a stranger over how many furs should be exchanged for a certain number of seashells. No one was carrying money. Not a single coin existed in this place. So how did they know what anything was worth? This is the part that has made many anthropologists rethink their entire understanding of the history of the human economy. For decades, textbooks taught that human societies began with barter, you give me a chicken, I give you a sack of grain, and eventually invented money to make those exchanges more convenient. It sounds perfectly logical. But anthropologist David Graeber, in research published in 2011, pointed out that there is almost no archaeological evidence showing that this kind of direct barter was ever the dominant economic system between strangers. What actually operated much more widely was a system built on debt and social memory. The old man beside Rin wasn't carefully counting exactly how many furs equaled how many seashells. He gave the stranger more than he needed, asking for nothing extra at that moment. He simply said one short sentence, almost like a promise. Next season, when your people return, bring me some good hides. There was no paperwork, no signature, only spoken words, and the memory of the hundreds of people standing around them as witnesses. If that stranger failed to keep his word the following season, the whole community would know, and his reputation would reach every other gathering place in the region before he did. It may sound fragile, but it was actually remarkably strong because it was built on honor, not on a quick transaction that ended the moment the exchange was over. If you've ever been invited to dinner at a friend's house in America several times without inviting them back even once, you've probably felt a little guilty, even if no one ever said anything. That is almost exactly the logic an entire ancient economy operated on, only on a much larger scale, lasting across hundreds of generations, with debts that sometimes took years to repay. The next morning, Rin met a man from a place even farther away than anywhere he had ever heard of. The man carried a piece of honey-colored amber that glowed in the morning sunlight. Through a translator who relied more on hand gestures than words, he explained that it came from a cold northern sea, where the waves washed these golden stones onto the sandy shore. Rin couldn't begin to imagine a distance that great. But tens of thousands of years later, archaeologists would uncover that very same kind of amber from the Baltic Sea in northern Europe inside ancient Egyptian tombs, thousands of miles from where it had formed, having passed through countless lands, countless languages, and countless unfamiliar hands, with no shipping company organizing any of it. There were only hundreds of small hand-to-hand exchanges, gradually accumulating over time, just like the way a rumor spreads from person to person until it has traveled halfway around the world. The man looked at Rin for a long moment, then smiled, revealing teeth worn down with age. He pointed to the piece of amber, then toward the horizon, making a repeated wave-like motion with his hand, as if to say that the journey it had taken was so long that even he had never traveled the entire distance himself. Rin didn't understand everything the man was trying to say with his hands, but he understood enough to realize that he was holding something that had traveled farther than anything he had ever imagined, farther even than the mountains he had just crossed to get there. Rin traded a handful of seashells for a small piece of amber, not because he needed it to survive, but because his father had told him it would bring more prestige to their family within the tribe, much like the way a rare gift earns someone greater respect. This is another important part that many people overlook when they think about an ancient market. Not every exchange was about survival. Many of them were about status and relationships, for much the same reason that some people today stand in line all night to buy the first limited edition pair of sneakers, even though the pair they already own is still perfectly good. Before leaving that clearing, Rin witnessed one more thing. The father of a girl from another tribe was having a serious conversation with one of the older men in Rin's group, not to exchange seashells or stone, but to discuss marrying his daughter to a young man from Rin's tribe. These periodic gatherings were not just places for exchanging goods. They were also the only time each year when tribes could find marriage partners for their children from other groups, preventing their communities from becoming increasingly inbred after generations of living apart. In other words, this market was even more important to the survival of humanity than it appeared to be. 6 days later, Rin returned home carrying a bag of glossy black obsidian and told the entire story to his younger siblings, who listened with their mouths hanging open. He told them about the old man who bargained with promises instead of carefully counting every item, about the man who had brought amber from the cold northern sea, and about the serious conversation between two fathers arranging marriages for their children. To the younger children, it all sounded like an adventure story. They were still too young to understand that their older brother had just passed through one small link in a vast system, a system so enormous that not even the oldest person in the tribe had ever seen it in its entirety. If that network had not existed, every tribe would have lived in complete isolation. And when one region was struck by disaster or famine, no one would have been able to help anyone else. That seemingly loose network built on debt, honor, and periodic gatherings like the clearing Rin had just left was what kept humanity from becoming regionally extinct again and again. Now come back to yourself. You're sitting somewhere, probably holding your phone, watching an online order change from packed to in transit, then arrived at the sorting facility and finally delivered. You're watching a high-speed version of the very same journey Rin once made. The only difference is that today the process takes just a few days instead of 6 days of walking through the mountains, and no one has to remember who owes what to whom anymore, because the bank does that for you. Ancient humans never walked into a roofed marketplace the way you imagine when you hear the words, "go to the market." But in a very real sense, they went to the market every day, for tens of thousands of years. The only difference was that their market stretched across an entire continent, and a small item like the piece of amber in Rin's bag might take hundreds of years, passing through hundreds of hands, before finally reaching the place where it belonged.